Welcome back, traveler of time and thought. Today, we drift once more into the shadows of the past, into a world of stone walls and whispered prayers, where faith was both freedom and prison, and the cost of devotion was nothing less than the soul itself. In this final chapter, we uncover the last and most haunting truth of the medieval nun's life, the price she paid for her unshakable faith. This is not a story of saints or sinners, but of human hearts bound to the divine by chains of belief. So take a breath, step quietly beyond the gates of the convent, and listen to what devotion truly demanded. The bell rings long before dawn. Its metallic cry cuts through the black stillness like a blade, echoing along stone corridors slick with night damp. You open your eyes to darkness. There is no window in your cell, only a thin slit in the wall through which the cold breath of morning slips in. You pull your wool blanket tighter around your shoulders, but it does little to stop the chill. You rise because you must. Hesitation is disobedience. Your feet touch the bare floor, cold, uneven stone polished by decades of weary souls. Around you, other doors creak open in unison. Shadows move quietly, hooded shapes gliding down the hall. No one speaks. The only sound is the rustle of habits and the hollow footsteps of obedience. The bell still tolls. It is time for matins, the first prayer of the day. The chapel is barely lit. A few flickering candles throwing trembling gold across the faces of saints carved in wood. The air smells of wax, dust, and incense. The sisters gather in their stalls, each one bowing low, the whisper of fabric filling the silence. You kneel, your knees pressing against the cold stone floor, and the chanting begins. Low voices rise and fall in perfect rhythm, Latin words memorized, not understood by many. The chant is hauntingly beautiful, but inside you feel only weariness. Hours pass like this, verse after verse, prayer after prayer. The rhythm of monastic life is built on repetition, designed to crush the ego, to empty you of self so that only God remains. But what no one tells you is how hard it is to empty yourself when you still feel the pulse of being alive, the ache in your back, the hunger in your belly, the fleeting thought of the world beyond the convent walls. When matins ends, you do not rest. The next service follows, lauds, then prime. Each is a step in the long staircase of the day, a climb toward spiritual purity through exhaustion. Only after prime are you allowed a small meal, bread hardened overnight and a bowl of thin porridge. You eat in silence. Even your chewing feels like a sin. A wooden sign reads ora et labora, pray and work. Those two words define your existence. Work begins as the sun finally rises. Some sisters tend the gardens, their hands numb with cold soil. Others scrub floors, wash laundry in icy water, or mend the garments of the poor. The convent sustains itself through labor, spinning wool, baking bread, copying manuscripts for patrons who pay handsomely for prayers in exchange. The superior, a woman who long ago surrendered her own name to the title mother, oversees everything with a gaze that spares no weakness. The rule of Saint Benedict governs all: humility, obedience, silence, chastity, poverty. There are 73 chapters in the rule, and each one defines what you may or may not do. You must bow your head when spoken to, keep your eyes lowered when walking, confess your smallest failings. You must never speak without permission, never laugh loudly, never express anger. Even joy must be modest, contained, purified. At first, you think you can bear it. After all, you came here to serve God. The outside world was full of chaos, plague, war, sin. Inside these walls, you hoped for peace, but peace here is not gentle. It is strict, cold, and absolute. It demands the sacrifice of your will. Midday brings sext, the next round of prayers. You kneel again. The bell dictates your life as a shepherd commands sheep. Between each prayer, you return to work, to silence, to submission, The hours blur. The convent's schedule is a circle, a wheel that never stops turning. Sometimes in the stillness your mind drifts. You imagine the village beyond the fields, the market with its colors and noise, the smell of roasted meat, the laughter of children. You catch yourself and beg forgiveness, whispering "me culpa" under your breath. To long for the world is to sin, to dream of freedom is pride. The afternoon sun spills through the narrow windows, carving thin lines of light across the chapel floor. You watch the dust dance in those rays, and think how even dust seems freer than you. When Vespers arrive, the evening prayer, you are already weary to the bone. The chanting feels endless. The words blur into a drone, and sometimes your mind slips away entirely. You wake from your daze to the stern eyes of Mother Superior. A nod is enough to send a chill through your spine. You know you will be assigned extra penance tonight. After Vespers comes the evening meal, the same as always: broth, bread, water, no meat, no spice, no indulgence. You eat in silence while one sister reads aloud from the scriptures, her voice echoing in the refectory. Every meal is a sermon, every bite is duty. Then comes compline, the final prayer before sleep. The bell rings one last time. You kneel once more, murmuring words you've said so often they have lost all meaning. When the candles are extinguished, darkness swallows everything. You walk back to your cell. The stone walls glisten faintly with damp. You lie down, fully clothed on your straw mattress. You are allowed 6 hours of rest before the bell calls you again. This is one day. Tomorrow will be the same. You begin to understand that time in the convent is not linear. It circles endlessly, like prayer beads slipping through fingers. Days become weeks, weeks become years. Your youth dissolves into repetition. You measure life not in seasons but in prayers, hundreds of thousands of them whispered into the cold air. For outsiders, the convent seems peaceful, serene, untouched by sin. But inside, peace feels like absence, the absence of laughter, of music, of human warmth. You exist, but barely. You are one small note in a choir that never ends. Yet strangely, some part of you clings to this order. The world outside was uncertain. Here everything is known. Every bell tells you where to be, every prayer what to think. The walls both imprison and protect you. You hate them and depend on them. That is the cruel paradox of devotion. You surrender freedom for certainty. Night deepens. The cold bites again. Somewhere in the darkness, a sister coughs. Another murmurs in her sleep. You stare at the ceiling and wonder how many years remain before your hands shake too much to work, before your voice fades from the choir, before you're laid in the small cemetery behind the chapel. You whisper one last prayer, not to be holy, but simply to endure. Morning comes again, but the concept of morning has lost its meaning. The bell is your sun. Its sound slices through whatever dreams dared to form. You rise in the same gray silence, move through the same narrow corridor, and kneel again before the same altar. The rhythm of life here is mercilessly precise. You could set a clock by the prayers, if clocks existed for you. You begin to realize that obedience is not merely expected. It is the currency of your survival. Every gesture, every breath is measured. The convent is a living machine, and you are one of its gears. If one falters, the whole structure quivers, and the superior will notice. When you were first brought here, the walls felt enormous, as if they might swallow you whole. Now they feel smaller, pressing in closer each day. You can sense their moisture when you sleep, smell their old age. The walls are witnesses, silent, indifferent, eternal, generations of women before you have whispered their confessions into these same stones. The walls keep their secrets better than any priest ever could. After the morning prayers, you are assigned to the kitchen. The air is thick with smoke from the hearth, the kind that makes your eyes water and your lungs burn. You knead dough in a wooden trough, the coarse flour sticking to your hands, the rhythm of your movements matching the rhythm of your chants. Around you, other nuns move like shadows, faces half. hidden under wimples, their eyes downcast. No one speaks, but communication happens through glances, a subtle nod, a passing of bread, a brief moment of shared fatigue. The bread is baked not only for the sisters, but also for the villagers who depend on the convent's charity. It is one of the few ways you still touch the outside world, though even that contact is filtered through duty. When the poor come to the gate for alms, you glimpse them only through the iron grill. You see their faces, roughened by wind and labor, and realize they have lives of their own, families, laughter, freedom. You envy them for their suffering, because it is their suffering, chosen, or at least lived. Yours feels borrowed, commanded. The hours crawl forward. After work, you are summoned to the chapter house for confession. Each sister kneels before the prioress and lists her failings. They are often smaller, arriving late to prayer, allowing a sinful thought, hesitating to obey. Yet every confession is treated as if it were a crime. The prioress listens without expression, then gives penance. Sometimes it is fasting, sometimes extra labor, sometimes the humiliation of kneeling in the refectory while others eat. Shame is a tool, and it sharpens the soul like a blade. Once you hesitated to speak during confession. You wanted to admit something deeper, a longing you could not name, a restlessness that haunted your prayers. But before you could form the words, fear sealed your lips. The prioress's eyes were steady, cold, waiting. You said nothing, only recited a lesser fault. That night you lay awake, wondering if silence itself was your greatest sin. Later that afternoon, the sisters gather in the scriptorium. Here, the convent copies sacred texts for wealthy patrons. The work is delicate, demanding patience and steady hands. You sit at a wooden desk, a sheet of parchment before you, quill poised, ink ready. The letters must be perfect. Any smudge is a mark against the soul. As you trace the Latin words, you think of the men who wrote them centuries ago. You wonder if they ever imagined that a woman, locked away in a cold convent, would one day copy their prayers line by line without understanding their full meaning. Sometimes your mind wanders to the life you might have had. Perhaps a small cottage near the forest, tending a garden, hearing the laughter of a child. The image comes unbidden and leaves you trembling with guilt. You force your focus back to the parchment, pressing the nib harder until it scratches. Ink stains your fingers, a sin of carelessness, and you whisper another apology to the God who seems to demand constant explanations. As evening approaches, a storm gathers outside. The wind howls through the cloisters, making the candles flicker. The bell rings again for vespers, its sound mingling with thunder. Inside the chapel, the air is heavy with the smell of rain and wax. The sisters chant louder to drown out the storm, but the walls tremble anyway. You imagine the world beyond, trees bending, rivers swelling, the untamed forces of creation raging against the stillness of your prison. After the final prayer, you are ordered to clean the chapel floor. The stone is slick from dripping wax and rainwater carried in by boots. You kneel with a rag, scrubbing until your hands ache. The task feels endless, like everything here, but there is something strangely hypnotic about it. The repetition, the simplicity. When you clean, you stop thinking. Maybe that's the point. Later, in the dormitory, the sisters prepare for bed in silence. The only light comes from a single candle. You can see their faces, pale, weary, ageless. Some are young, some old, yet they all look the same under the veil of fatigue. Each one has surrendered her name, her voice, her desires. You wonder if anyone outside these walls even remembers that you once existed as an individual. As you lie down, you hear faint singing from another cell. A lullaby, maybe, or a prayer whispered through tears. It's forbidden, of course. Silence after compline is sacred, but no one reports her. You all understand that sometimes the heart needs to sing, even when the soul is tired. The rain continues through the night, drumming softly on the roof. You drift into uneasy sleep, dreaming of open fields, of wind in your hair, of laughter. When the bell rings again before dawn, it feels like waking from life itself. The next morning begins not with thought, but with movement. Your body has learned to obey before your mind awakens. The sound of the bell vibrates through your bones. It has become part of you now, like a heartbeat you do not control. You move through the corridor barefoot, the flagstones biting cold against your skin. A line of sisters glides ahead of you, each one identical in the half, light. There is something ghostly about the sight. Black habits flowing, faces hidden, the faint whisper of prayers escaping pale lips. You sometimes think that if a stranger walked in, they would not see women at all, but shadows given form. In the chapel, the candles have burned low through the night. Their smoke lingers, curling like thin ghosts above the altar. The chant begins again. You join it, though your voice feels distant, as if it belongs to someone else. The Latin words fall from your mouth, empty but familiar, like stones dropped into an endless well. The chapel windows are small and high, designed not to tempt the eyes with views of the world. But this morning, a faint light breaks through the clouds, painting a golden beam across the floor. Dust drifts lazily in that light, swirling with a quiet grace. You watch it and think how even the smallest specks of dust have more freedom than you. After prayers, the sisters disperse for work. Today, your duty is in the herb garden. The air outside is crisp, sharp with the scent of damp earth. You pull your cloak tighter and step into the patch of soil enclosed by the convent walls. Here, at least, there is color, green leaves, brown soil, yellow blossoms. It is one of the few places where life dares to grow under the watchful eyes of piety. You bend to pull weeds, fingers sinking into cold dirt. Beside you, an older sister named Agnes works silently. Her face is lined like an old map, every wrinkle a trace of years spent under obedience. You've never heard her raise her voice. When she looks up, her gray eyes hold a strange calm, resigned, yet kind. Once, when no one was watching, Agnes whispered to you, "The earth remembers what we forget." You didn't understand then. But now, as you dig and plant, you start to see. The soil keeps its secrets, just like the stones of the chapel. It swallows pain, it swallows tears, and still it blooms. A small bird lands on the garden wall, a sparrow, brown and ordinary. It hops closer, eyeing you with cautious curiosity. For a moment, you freeze, afraid to move, afraid to break the fragile connection. Then it flies away, disappearing into the blue beyond the walls. The sudden emptiness it leaves feels larger than the sky itself. Later, back inside, you pass the novices' quarters. The newest arrivals, girls barely 14, kneel in a row as the prioress instructs them on the vows they will soon take: poverty, chastity, obedience. Her voice is steady, unwavering, carved from years of authority. The girls' faces are pale, their eyes wide, some are trembling. You see yourself in them, young, frightened, desperate to please. When you first arrived, you believed holiness would feel like peace. Instead, it feels like surrender, like dissolving. You remember your first days vividly, the ceremony, the chants, the moment your hair was cut away and your name replaced by a saint's. They called it a rebirth, but it felt like erasure. You pause at the doorway, listening as one girl begins to cry softly. The sound is muffled, but it stabs at something deep inside you. The prioress continues speaking, unmoved. "The world is temptation," she says. "Only through discipline may your soul be saved." That night, the memory of that girl's tears lingers. You can't help but wonder what sin the world could hold that would be worse than this quiet despair. Days bleed into each other. The bell rings, prayers are said, the cycle repeats. Sometimes you forget which day it is. Feast days are the only markers of time, and even they feel like faint ripples in an endless sea. Then, one afternoon, something unusual happens. A messenger arrives at the convent gates, a man in travel, worn clothes carrying a letter sealed with wax. The superior reads it aloud during supper. It is a request from a local nobleman. The convent is to send 2 sisters to nurse his wife, who has fallen ill. Your name is chosen. The announcement shocks you. To leave the convent, even briefly, feels almost sinful, but also thrilling. That night you cannot sleep. Your heart beats faster than it has in years. You imagine the world beyond, the smell of trees, the sound of human voices unbound by rules. The next morning, you and Sister Agnes prepare to depart. The gates open with a groan. The world outside seems brighter than you remember, overwhelming in its color and sound. The air smells of rain and wood smoke. You walk down the path, the convent shrinking behind you until it's just a shape against the hills. For the first time in years, you feel the ground uneven beneath your feet, the wind brushing your face. It's both exhilarating and terrifying. Agnes walks quietly beside you, her eyes scanning the horizon with the look of someone who remembers too much. The nobleman's manor is only a few miles away, but every step feels like crossing an ocean. When you arrive, servants rush to greet you, and for the first time, people bow to you, calling you Holy Sister. You are offered bread with honey, a luxury you haven't tasted since childhood. The sweetness shocks your tongue, almost bringing tears to your eyes. In the sick room, the nobleman's wife lies pale and feverish. You spend the day tending to her, washing her forehead, whispering prayers. The house is filled with warmth, firelight, laughter from distant rooms, the soft clatter of life continuing. You realize how loud the world is outside the convent, how alive. That night, you sleep in a small chamber overlooking the fields. Through the window you see stars, real stars, not the faint glimmers hidden by convent walls. For a long time you just stare, your breath slow, your heart calm. You wonder if God feels closer out here, or if he ever lived behind the convent walls at all. In the morning, you and Agnes return. The gates close again behind you, their sound final, heavy, echoing through your bones. Everything looks the same, yet feels smaller. The air seems thinner, the silence sharper. You kneel in the chapel for confession. I saw beauty in the world. You whisper, the confessor's voice, muffled by the screen, answers simply, then pray it away. And you do, but you know something has changed. You've seen beyond the walls, and part of you will never forget. The bells toll again, heavy, slow, and mournful. Each strike echoes through the courtyard like a heartbeat, signaling another ceremony of devotion. But behind the sacred hymns and flowing robes, there is a truth that history rarely tells. For many of the women kneeling before the altar, this is not a wedding of love, but of resignation. They are called the brides of Christ. Yet they are brides without desire, without choice, and without freedom. In the medieval world, marriage was rarely about love. It was about property, power, and alliances. Women were pawns in the political and economic games of their fathers and brothers. And when a daughter could not be married, whether because her family lacked wealth for a dowry, or because there were too many daughters and too few suitors, there was another solution: the convent, a sacred dumping ground disguised as divine destiny. To understand why so many women ended up behind cloistered walls, you must first understand the economics of medieval life. A nobleman's fortune was finite, his land limited. Sons inherited estates, daughters required dowries to marry well. The more daughters a man had, the heavier the financial burden. Marrying each one off meant draining resources, and in a society obsessed with lineage and property, that could not be allowed. So the church offered an alternative. Instead of a worldly husband, your daughter could wed Christ himself. The cost, a fraction of a marriage dowry. the benefit, eternal salvation, or so they said. It was, on paper, a holy arrangement. In reality, it was often a quiet tragedy. Young girls were sent to convents not out of spiritual calling, but out of convenience. Some were as young as 7, placed in religious care to be raised among the holy. Others were delivered at 12 or 13, barely teenagers, already stripped of the possibility of ordinary life. Their families called it a blessing. The girls called it fate. Imagine being one of them, a child who still dreams of laughter, sunlight, and running barefoot through meadows. One day your father tells you you've been chosen by God. You'll wear the veil, not a wedding dress. You'll spend your days in prayer, not in play. You don't understand the weight of the words eternal vows. You just see tears in your mother's eyes and pride in your father's. You don't know that this decision is irreversible. The ceremony itself was grand, an imitation of marriage, complete with vows, rings, and candles. The bishop presided, the choir sang hymns of devotion, and the girl stood trembling before the altar. "You are now the bride of Christ," the priest would declare, placing a ring upon her finger. But for many, this holy union was a form of spiritual servitude. Her life no longer belonged to her, not even to her family. She was now property of the church. It's difficult to grasp how little control these women had. In an age where obedience was the highest virtue, resistance was nearly impossible. To defy your father's will was to defy God's appointed order. The church taught that parents were divine instruments. To obey them was to obey heaven. And so, even if a girl cried, begged, or fainted at the altar, the ceremony continued. There are historical records of women who screamed during their vows, who tried to flee the church mid-ceremony only to be dragged back by family and clergy. Their tears were called weakness, their protests temptation. One chronicler in the 12th century tells of a young noblewoman who tried to escape her forced profession by hiding in the monastery stables the night before her consecration. When she was found, she pleaded, "I am not called by God." The bishop's reply was chilling. "It is not you who choose, but he who chooses you." She was veiled the next morning, her face pale, her voice silent. Her family considered it a triumph. The church recorded it as a conversion. These so-called brides often entered their new lives in shock. The world outside faded quickly, replaced by strict routines of prayer, silence, and submission. The convent was designed to erase the self, to turn individuals into instruments of divine order. And for the unwanted brides, this was both physical and spiritual death. Some adapted, some broke, and some resisted in secret ways that history barely remembers. But why did the church accept, even encourage, these forced vocations? The answer lies in the deep intertwining of faith and economy. Each new nun brought a dowry, small but valuable, land, coin, or goods. Convents needed income to survive, and families needed respectable ways to dispose of unmarried daughters. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement, sealed in sanctity but rooted in pragmatism. Behind the language of devotion was the logic of trade. Souls, it seemed, could be bartered like cattle. There was also a powerful social ideology at work, the belief that a woman's body was dangerous, that her desires could lead to ruin. The convent was a way to control that danger. By binding women to celibacy, the church kept them contained, chaste, and silent. A nun's virtue was not her own achievement, but her confinement's result. She was praised for purity, a purity born from imprisonment. Yet not all unwanted brides accepted their fate quietly. Some rebelled subtly, cleverly, dangerously. There are accounts of nuns smuggling letters to lovers, bribing gatekeepers, or even disguising themselves as men to flee. One remarkable case from the 14th century tells of a nun in Italy who escaped her convent. lived as a man for years, and only revealed her identity on her deathbed. Others rebelled through words. They wrote letters to bishops, pleading for release, claiming they had never consented to their vows. The Church's response was almost always the same: endure your cross in patience. Freedom was not an option. It's easy to imagine these women as powerless victims, but their inner worlds were often complex. Some found ways to reclaim small fragments of agency within the constraints. A few became skilled scribes, artists, or musicians, using their talents as a form of quiet resistance. Some turned their spiritual writings into coded expressions of pain or longing. When a nun wrote of her divine bridegroom in passionate language, it was not always clear if she was describing spiritual love or suppressed human emotion. The lines blurred between faith and desire, between prayer and protest. The idea of being a bride of Christ carried enormous weight. It was both exalted and dehumanizing. It granted women a sacred identity, yet stripped them of earthly worth. They were expected to see themselves as eternally married, bound to a husband who would never hold them, who would never whisper comfort or forgiveness. Their every emotion had to be translated into prayer. Love became piety, desire became guilt, loneliness became devotion, and in that constant transformation, many lost themselves entirely. The Church encouraged this spiritual marriage through ritual and symbolism. A nun's ring was called the annulus Christi, the ring of Christ. Her veil represented both humility and marital union. During certain feasts, nuns would renew their vows as brides might renew wedding promises. The language was tender, intimate, and often deeply emotional, but it was also manipulative. It turned religious servitude into a romance, a divine love story that justified suffering. The unwanted brides were taught to see their confinement as holy passion. To question it was to betray their heavenly spouse. In some cases, the emotional toll manifested in visions, ecstasies, and mystical experiences. Women deprived of real love sometimes found escape in divine fantasy. Some claimed to see Christ in dreams, to feel his touch, to receive his words. To modern readers, these accounts might sound delusional or erotic, but to their contemporaries, they were signs of holiness. The irony is painful. The same system that suppressed women's emotions also sanctified their breakdowns. The convents themselves varied greatly. Some were strict, cold, and silent. Others, especially those for wealthy families, were surprisingly comfortable, filled with books, gardens, and music. But even in the gentler ones, the core reality was the same. These women had not chosen this path. Their holiness was a mask for obedience, their purity a symbol of their powerlessness. And when the veil came down, there was no going back. Canon law was clear. Vows were lifelong. A woman who left her convent without permission was a fugitive in the eyes of God. Some were hunted down, excommunicated, or even imprisoned by secular authorities at the Church's request. The veil was not just a symbol, it was a chain. For some, the only escape was death. Chroniclers describe nuns who starved themselves deliberately, who prayed for illness, who confessed to sins they never committed just to feel human again. Others lived on quietly, their souls eroded by monotony. One 13th century abbess wrote in her private notes, "We live not as brides, but as widows whose husbands never come." And yet, even amid this sorrow, the Church glorified the image of the joyful nun, serene, devoted, radiant in her faith. Artworks showed them gazing heavenward, lips parted in divine ecstasy. But those images were lies, propaganda for a system that buried women alive in sanctity. The reality was quieter, grimmer. Behind every painted saint's smile was a woman who once had dreams of family, of laughter, of freedom, dreams that died the moment her veil was lowered. In some regions, particularly in Northern Europe, the Reformation brought a brutal end to many convents. When Protestant reformers attacked monastic life, some nuns welcomed liberation, others wept for the loss of their only home. It's telling that even when freedom came, it was not of their choosing. The unwanted brides of Christ remained caught between two worlds, unwanted by their families, and now abandoned by their church. But history is never just tragedy. Within this suffering, there were moments of strength, quiet, defiant, and unforgettable. Some nuns became scholars, writing treatises and letters that challenged church authority from within. Others turned their convents into refuges for the poor or sanctuaries for women escaping abuse. A few even used their supposed weakness as power, manipulating male clergy through pious language to gain small freedoms. They learned to survive by mastering the very system that oppressed them. Still, for every woman who found a way to endure, there were countless others who faded into silence. Their names lost, their graves unmarked, their lives reduced to footnotes in dusty archives. They were unwanted in life and forgotten in death, the brides of Christ who never chose their groom, the daughters who never chose their fate. Centuries later, when we look back at the medieval convent, it's easy to romanticize it, to see it as a place of prayer and peace. But to truly understand it, you must hear the whispers between the prayers, the voices of those who never wanted to be there, who cried themselves to sleep on cold stone floors, who kissed the crucifix not out of love, but out of surrender. Their stories challenge the notion that holiness is always chosen, that devotion is always free. They remind us that faith can be both beautiful and cruel, that even in the name of God, humans have caged one another. The unwanted brides of Christ were casualties of a world that feared women's freedom more than it feared sin, and yet they endure in memory. Every convent wall that still stands carries the echo of their footsteps. Every ancient manuscript copied by a nun's hand carries her silent endurance. They may have been unwanted, but they were not meaningless. Their suffering shaped histories hidden half the story of women bound in the name of purity, whose strength lay not in rebellion, but in survival. As the final hymn fades and the candles burn low, we are left with a haunting truth. They were called brides, but they were never loved. They were told to serve God, but what they served was the will of men. And yet, in their forced devotion, they became something more, witnesses to the cost of obedience and the quiet resilience of the human spirit. The unwanted brides of Christ were not weak. They were prisoners who learned to pray in their chains. They were daughters of silence, sisters of endurance, mothers of forgotten history. And though the world buried their names beneath stone and scripture, their story still breathes in every question we ask about freedom, choice, and the price of faith. The church bells echo again, not with celebration but with duty. Their metallic cries roll through the cold corridors, over the stone floors, and into the narrow cells where women stir from uneasy sleep. Dawn has not yet broken, but the convent already breathes with ritual. Inside these holy walls, time is measured not by sun or season, but by prayer and endurance. This is not a sanctuary of peace. It is a crucible of hardship. The medieval convent was supposed to be heaven on earth, a place of divine devotion, free from the corruption of the world. Yet in truth, it was a world of its own, a small, self-contained universe where obedience ruled, suffering was sanctified, and comfort was treated as sin. The nuns who lived within it carried crosses heavier than the world ever saw. To the outside world, they were the purest of souls, but inside they were cold, hungry, lonely, and often afraid. The day began in darkness. At the sound of the bell, the sisters rose from thin straw mattresses laid on wooden boards. The air bit their faces, the chill of stone seeped into their bones. There were no fireplaces in most dormitories. Warmth was seen as indulgence. Even during the frozen nights of winter, they prayed in unheated chapels, their breath forming ghostly clouds that hovered above their bowed heads. Frost clung to the edges of their robes. Fingers stiffened, cracked, and bled as they turned the pages of their psalters. But they did not complain. Suffering, they were told, was holy. Before dawn, the first prayers began, matins and lauds, a chorus of tired voices echoing through the chapel. The chants were ancient and haunting, rising like incense toward the vaulted ceiling. Yet, beneath the beauty of the sound lay exhaustion. For many, these prayers came after only a few hours of restless sleep. Some nuns fainted during the early services, overcome by hunger or cold. The rule was simple: no comfort without sacrifice. After prayer came labor. Each convent was a self-sustaining world. The sisters baked bread, tended gardens, cleaned, spun wool, made candles, and copied manuscripts. Every hour was accounted for, every motion watched. Work was not just necessity, it was discipline. The body must be kept busy so that the mind would not wander to temptation. A nun's day was carved into obedience from sunrise to nightfall. Her will was no longer her own. Meals were meager and repetitive. Bread, beans, thin soups, and vegetables formed the staples. Meat was banned except for the sick, and even then, only with permission. Fasting was frequent, sometimes lasting for days. In theory, this self-denial was to purify the soul. In reality, it often led to fainting, malnutrition, and disease. Historians studying convent records have found entries for sisters who died not of plague or violence, but of holy weakness, a polite phrase for starvation. Yet it was not just the body that suffered. The mind and spirit bore equal torment. Silence was the rule in many orders. Conversations were forbidden except during designated hours. Laughter was a sin of levity. Even friendship could be suspect. Affection between nuns was closely monitored. Emotional intimacy was seen as a threat to spiritual purity. Imagine living year after year surrounded by women, yet unable to speak freely, unable to express sorrow or joy. Isolation became internal, a loneliness so complete that even prayer could not always pierce it. Discipline was strict and often cruel. Every convent had its rule, a code of conduct dictating everything from clothing to gestures to thoughts. The rule of Saint Benedict, for instance, demanded absolute obedience. To disobey, even in small matters, was to disobey God himself. If a nun broke silence, laughed too loudly, arrived late for prayers, or showed pride, punishment followed. Some were made to kneel on cold stone floors for hours, others forced to fast or wear coarse ropes under their robes as instruments of penance. Public humiliation was common, confession of faults before the entire community, tears streaming while the abbess pronounced rebuke. The goal was not justice, but humility. The convent did not correct behavior, it crushed the will. Despite the severity, there was rarely malice in these acts. The abbess herself had once been a novice, trained in the same hardness. She believed that suffering forged virtue, that breaking pride was the only path to salvation. The entire structure of convent life was built on this belief, that the body must be denied so the soul could ascend. But for the women living it, holiness often felt indistinguishable from punishment. Illness thrived in the convent. Damp walls, poor ventilation, and inadequate diet weakened the body. Epidemics like typhus and plague spread quickly in the closed spaces. Doctors were rare, and many believed sickness was divine testing. Instead of medicine, the sick were given relics to touch, holy water to drink, and prayers for endurance. There are records of nuns suffering from untreated infections, blindness, and fevers that lasted months. Some accepted it as a cross to bear. Others whispered in despair, wondering why God's house felt so much like a prison of suffering. The convent's hardships were not limited to physical deprivation. Power struggles and human tensions brewed beneath the surface of piety. Where people live together in confinement, envy and pride inevitably grow. Abbesses wielded authority that could border on tyranny. Novices were expected to serve in silence, cleaning and laboring while elders supervised. Petty rivalries could turn into accusations of sin or possession. The devil, after all, was said to lurk everywhere, especially among women. Some nuns accused others of witchcraft or demonic temptation, their fears inflamed by clergy eager to see evil everywhere but themselves. And yet, amidst this severity, life persisted. There were moments, small, fleeting, when the sisters found humanity again, a shared smile when no one was watching, a loaf of bread quietly passed to the hungriest, a whispered song, not from the hymnal, but from childhood memory. These gestures did not break the rule, they softened it. In the midst of hardship, compassion found cracks in the stone. One of the most difficult burdens was the vow of obedience. Once taken, it erased individuality. The abbess could assign any task, however humiliating or painful, and the sister had to obey. To refuse was a mortal sin. There are records of nuns ordered to scour floors with their tongues as penance, to wear chains under their clothes, to sleep without blankets for years. Obedience was total, unquestioned, and absolute. Even thoughts of rebellion had to be confessed, and yet many of these women were not weak. They endured the unendurable. Some even found meaning within the hardship. They believed that every ache of the body brought them closer to God's suffering. The convent taught that pain was purification. To live without comfort was to share Christ's poverty. To weep was to wash away sin. It was a theology of endurance, and it kept them alive when hope was scarce. Still, for every nun who found solace in sacrifice, there was another who broke beneath its weight. The convent was not immune to despair. Some sisters experienced what we would now call depression or psychosis, but in those days, such suffering was interpreted as possession or divine testing. The remedies were spiritual: exorcism, more prayer, or solitude. The very walls that enclosed them became mirrors of their torment. There are haunting accounts of nuns scratching prayers into the stone of their cells, leaving behind marks that still exist centuries later. These were not saints in ecstasy, they were women crying out to be seen. At times, even nature seemed to conspire against them. The cold seeped through stone walls, rats infested the storerooms, floods ruined crops, and famine followed. When food ran out, the sisters rationed in silence, praying for divine mercy that seldom came. They believed that every hardship was part of God's mysterious plan, but when hunger gnawed and illness spread, faith itself became a struggle. Some abbesses wrote of nights spent doubting heaven, wondering if their prayers reached beyond the ceiling. Others confessed to feeling abandoned by the very God they had given their lives to serve. Beyond the physical and spiritual suffering, there was another kind of pain, the pain of memory. Many nuns had entered the convent unwillingly, torn from families and lovers. Over time, they were told to forget the world, but the heart remembers what the mind tries to bury. Some clung secretly to small tokens from their past: a ring, a ribbon, a letter. These objects, hidden beneath straw mattresses or behind loose stones, became their only link to who they once were. Discovery meant punishment, but they kept them nonetheless. It was rebellion in its most human form, to remember. And when death came, it came quietly. The burial was simple. The body wrapped in a habit, laid in the convent cemetery without name or inscription. To die as a nun was to vanish into anonymity. The community would chant prayers, then return to their routine. Another soul gone, another voice silenced. The living could not mourn long. There were prayers to recite, chores to finish, bells to answer, but not all hardships were born of cruelty. Some came from genuine devotion, the sincere belief that earthly life was fleeting and only spiritual purity mattered. Many sisters accepted suffering willingly, even joyfully. To the modern mind, this seems madness. But to them, hardship was meaning. The harsher the life, the greater the glory in heaven. They sought not happiness, but holiness. Over time, however, cracks appeared in the system. reformers and critics began to question the severity of convent life. Some argued that forced vows and endless penance had corrupted the true spirit of devotion. By the late Middle Ages, movements arose calling for moderation, for compassion. Yet, for centuries before change came, countless women endured the same daily hardships, unseen, unheard, unremembered. If we could walk through one of those convents now, centuries later, we might still feel their presence. The worn steps where bare feet climbed to chapel, the faded murals on cold walls, the tiny cells where women prayed themselves to sleep. Every stone carries a trace of their endurance. Their hardship shaped not only their lives but the spiritual imagination of an entire age. The image of the suffering nun became a symbol of virtue, proof that holiness could be carved from pain. But it also served as a warning. The harder the walls, the quieter the hearts within them. The more sacred the rule, the more human lives it consumed. The convent may have been built for God, but it was maintained by the suffering of women. And yet there is something undeniably powerful about their endurance. They did not rebel, they did not flee. They bore the weight of history in silence. Through famine, illness, punishment, and loneliness, they remained. Their strength was not loud. It was hidden in obedience, in whispered prayers, in the will to keep breathing when everything felt lost. To modern eyes, their world seems unbearable. But to understand them, you must see through theirs. They lived in an age where suffering was sacred, where hardship was the currency of salvation. To them, the holy walls were not only barriers. They were mirrors reflecting the human struggle to find meaning in pain. Within those walls, the divine and the desperate intertwined until they were indistinguishable. When the final bell rang each night and the candles were extinguished one by one, the convent sank again into darkness. But even then, in the silence, the prayers continued, not from lips, but from hearts that refused to give up. Each woman carried her burden, believing that one day, beyond the walls, peace would come. Perhaps not in life, but in the eternity they had been promised. And so, behind those holy walls, amid hunger, frost, silence, and sorrow, something enduring was forged. The unbreakable will of women who learned to find God not in comfort, but in survival. The human soul is a fragile thing. It can endure hunger, cold, and exhaustion, but when deprived of freedom and joy, it begins to fade. Inside the medieval convent, there were wounds that no penance could heal, wounds of the spirit, invisible to the world beyond its walls. This was the silent suffering of the soul, a pain so deep that even the sound of prayer could not drown it. Every day within those cloisters began the same, the echo of bells, the rustle of coarse habits, the murmuring of psalms. Outwardly, everything seemed ordered, sacred, serene, but behind the veil of devotion lived another truth, one that no chronicle dared to record. The convent was filled not only with prayer, but with longing. Women who had once laughed, dreamed, and loved, now found themselves trapped in a life that demanded the death of everything human within them. They were told the convent was God's garden, but for many, it felt more like a tomb of the living. It was here that the soul faced its fiercest battles, not with the devil, but with despair. When the body is punished, it cries out. When the spirit is punished, it learns to whisper, then to grow quiet, until even the whisper dies. The silence of the convent was meant to bring peace, but silence can also be a form of torture. Imagine days without laughter, months without conversation, years without the simple comfort of being known. Each sister carried her thoughts like stones in her chest, heavy and unspoken. The rule forbade idle talk, but the mind does not stop speaking when the mouth is closed. It wanders, it remembers, it questions. And in that silence, memories grew louder than the bells. Some remembered the world they had left, the sunlight on fields, the warmth of family, the songs of market days. Others remembered faces, friends, lovers, children they would never hold again. Those memories became both comfort and torment, flickering like candles that refused to go out. To remember was to suffer, to forget was to die. In that tension, the soul began to twist. The church taught that longing was sin, that nostalgia was temptation. So the women fought their own hearts in secret. Every time they felt affection, they prayed for it to vanish. Every time they missed someone, they begged God for the strength to stop remembering. But no amount of prayer can erase the human heart. The more they tried to silence it, the more painfully it beat. Confession was meant to free them, yet it often deepened their wounds. A nun would kneel before her confessor, whispering her struggles through the lattice, how she had dreamed of the world, how she had felt envy, how she had doubted God. Instead of compassion, she was often met with rebuke. The priest would remind her that her desires were unholy, that doubt was rebellion, and so she left the confessional not lighter, but heavier, convinced she was failing heaven itself. Many convents had what was called the discipline room, a small chamber used for penance. There the sisters would strike themselves with cords or scourges, believing each blow could cleanse the soul. Some did it out of obedience, others out of desperation, to feel something real, something within their control. The pain of the body became a strange kind of relief, a way to drown the pain of the heart. In that small, dark room, you could hear the faint sound of leather against flesh, mingled with whispers of prayers and tears. This was not madness, it was survival. For centuries, theologians praised these women as examples of holy suffering, but few stopped to ask what that suffering did to them. When a soul is told that its natural feelings are sin, when it is trained to mistrust joy, curiosity, and love, it slowly forgets how to live. The convent created saints, yes, but it also created ghosts, women who moved and spoke, but whose inner light had dimmed to a flicker. Some found strange visions in their suffering. There were nuns who claimed to see angels, to receive messages from heaven. Historians now know that many of these visions came during long fasts, sleepless nights, or fevers, conditions that blur the line between the spiritual and the hallucinatory. But in a world that dismissed women's voices, these visions became their only language. To speak of God was safe, to speak of pain was not. So they wrapped their grief in the language of ecstasy. When they said an angel appeared, perhaps it was loneliness in disguise. Take the story of a sister who spent months praying to feel God's presence. One night, weakened by hunger, she felt warmth fill her chest and light fill the room. She believed it was Christ embracing her. In truth, it might have been the fainting glow of her own consciousness, desperate to find meaning before collapsing. Yet in that illusion she found peace. The convent had taken her body, her imagination became the only doorway left open. For others, even faith itself began to rot. They prayed and heard nothing. They fasted and saw no visions. They gave everything and felt only emptiness. This was the darkest torment of all, the sense that heaven was silent. It is one thing to suffer for a cause, it is another to suffer for nothing. When belief faltered, guilt devoured what little peace remained. To doubt was sin, but to believe without feeling was agony. In that void, the soul suffered quietly, unseen, unhealed. There was also the pain of repression, the constant denial of the self. The vow of chastity demanded not only abstinence, but the suppression of all desire. Yet desire is not easily killed. It hides in dreams, in glances, in the accidental touch of a hand. Some nuns confessed to feelings for fellow sisters or priests, terrified of damnation. The Church saw such emotions as proof of the devil's work. But beneath theology was a simple truth. They were human. The heart still wanted what the vow forbade, and so they fought themselves every day, turning love into guilt, longing into shame. Loneliness gnawed at the soul more than hunger ever could. The convent was full of women, yet utterly devoid of intimacy. No one was allowed to comfort another too tenderly. A hug could be misinterpreted. A friendship could be forbidden. Many sisters went years without hearing their own names spoken with affection. To be seen only as sister was to lose identity, to become faceless in a sea of devotion. The absence of self became a kind of death, the slow erasure of I. Nighttime was the hardest. When the prayers ended and the candles dimmed, each woman was left alone with her thoughts. The stone cell was silent except for the distant sound of wind or rain. Some prayed themselves to sleep. Others lay awake, counting regrets like rosary beads. They thought of the lives they might have lived, children they would never have, roads they would never walk, laughter they would never hear again. Guilt followed every memory, yet they could not help remembering. It was the only way to feel alive. The church told them that suffering purified, but few spoke of what it destroyed. Too much pain can twist the soul inward, turning faith into fear. There were sisters who began to believe God hated them, that they were beyond saving. The more they prayed, the more unworthy they felt. This was the cruel paradox of their devotion. The holier they tried to be, the farther heaven seemed to drift. Some lost themselves completely. They wandered the corridors muttering prayers that no longer made sense, eyes hollow, minds broken by years of isolation. Others withdrew into silence so deep they forgot how to speak. These women were sometimes revered as mystics, their madness mistaken for divine trance. In reality, they were casualties of a system that confused suffering with sanctity. Yet not all the silent suffering was tragic. In the darkest corners, resilience was born. A few learned to transform their pain into something unbreakable. They found strength in endurance, wisdom in solitude. They began to write, secretly, dangerously, scribbling their thoughts into margins of prayer books, hiding words between lines of Latin hymns. These fragments still survive, faint ink on brittle parchment, revealing a chorus of unheard voices. They wrote of doubt, of longing, of the mystery of love that survives even in captivity. Through those words, they reclaimed a piece of their souls. One wrote, "My cage has no door, but my heart still flies." Another, "I have been buried alive, yet in this grave I have found God." These were not confessions of despair, but defiance. The church could silence their tongues, but not their minds. In their secret writings, they became philosophers, poets, and witnesses of their own existence. Still, for most, the suffering remained voiceless. The church's hierarchy had little interest in women's inner worlds. A nun's duty was to obey, not to think. Her soul was property of the divine, administered by men who seldom understood her life. Priests and bishops visited rarely, and when they did, they spoke in the language of theology, not empathy. The nuns were expected to be examples, not individuals. Their pain was seen as proof of virtue, not a call for compassion. And so the centuries passed, and the convent's silence deepened. Generations of women came and went, each inheriting the same walls, the same rules, the same unspoken grief. The outside world changed. Kings rose and fell, wars burned and ended. But inside the cloister, time stood still. The rhythm of prayer never faltered, the bell never stopped. The soul's suffering became tradition. There were rare moments of rebellion, small but significant. A sister might sneak a forbidden song into evening prayer, its melody faint but unmistakably human. Another might slip food to a starving novice, defying the rule for the sake of mercy. These quiet acts of compassion were their resistance. In a world that demanded silence, kindness became revolution. Yet even rebellion had to hide beneath piety. If caught, a nun could be punished or expelled. a fate often worse than death, for it meant eternal disgrace. So their defiance was subtle, coded in hymns, hidden in gestures, whispered in prayers that meant something different than they sounded. Within the sacred walls, survival required a delicate balance, to obey outwardly while keeping a small corner of the soul free. Perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. Even in their suffering, these women found ways to remain human. They could not speak their pain, but they could live it with dignity. They could not escape the convent, but they could create an inner world where hope still flickered. In that invisible space, the soul endured. Centuries later, historians study these women through the fragments they left: letters, prayers, confessions, even recipes. Each piece is a glimpse into a mind that refused to be erased, and what they reveal is not only suffering, but complexity. These were not saints or victims alone. They were thinkers, dreamers, survivors. They bore silence not because they were weak, but because they had no choice, and still, somehow, they kept faith in something greater than their pain. If we listen closely to the past, we can still hear them, the echoes of footsteps in the cloister, the soft turning of a page, the sigh that escapes during prayer. These sounds are the remnants of their endurance, the language of silent suffering. The medieval nun's life was filled with contradictions: devotion and despair, obedience and defiance, silence and song. Her soul was stretched between heaven and earth, between what she was told to believe and what she felt in her heart. And though history remembers her as meek, her endurance tells another story. It tells of women who faced unthinkable loneliness and still found beauty in the act of surviving. The suffering of their souls may have been silent, but silence does not mean absence. Beneath those quiet lives burned the same fire that has always driven humanity, the desire to be seen, to be loved, to be free. They prayed for heaven, but in their endurance they created something just as sacred, proof that even in the darkest cages, the soul still seeks light. And perhaps that is the ultimate irony. The Church sought to make them saints by stripping them of self, yet in doing so, it revealed the boundless strength of the self it tried to erase. Their pain was not wasted, it became testimony. The silent suffering of their souls was not defeat, it was witness, a whisper that has outlived the walls that contained it. When the final bell rang each night and the candles burned low, the sisters would lie down in their narrow beds, facing the same ceiling stones their mothers in faith had stared at centuries before. And in the stillness, perhaps one of them would close her eyes and think, not of heaven or hell, but of the sky beyond those walls. For a moment, she would feel the pulse of her own soul, stubborn, alive, unbroken. Then the dawn would come, the bell would sound, and the silent suffering would begin again. But somewhere deep within, she would know, silence cannot last forever. The soul, though silenced, never stops singing. Inside the convent walls, those same gray stones that trapped so many souls, there was something no rule, no vow, and no priest could truly extinguish. It was small at first, nearly invisible, a flicker of self-awareness, a quiet intuition that the women of the cloister carried something sacred that was not written in any scripture. For centuries, historians have told the story of their suffering, their obedience, their silence. But buried beneath that silence lived another truth, the hidden power within them, subtle yet unbreakable, a power that transformed not only their own lives, but the spiritual history of the entire Middle Ages. At first glance, it seems impossible. How could women stripped of freedom, sealed away behind iron gates, wield any power at all? Yet power does not always roar. Sometimes it breathes quietly through endurance, through wisdom, through creation. The medieval nun learned early that she could not rule with sword or title. She could not inherit lands or command armies, but she could shape minds, preserve words, nurture the sick, and challenged the very meaning of holiness itself. Her strength was invisible to the world, but unmistakable to those who lived beside her. The Church wanted them humble. It told them their purpose was submission, but submission, when practiced long enough, can transform into something else, mastery of self. The convent became a paradoxical forge where weakness turned into resilience. Each act of obedience, each denied desire, each day of silence became training in inner control. The world beyond the walls was ruled by men who fought and conquered. Inside, women learned to conquer themselves. That discipline, honed through deprivation, made them powerful in ways that few could understand. When one loses all external freedom, the only kingdom left to rule is the inner one, and within that kingdom, the nun was sovereign. In the dim hours before dawn, when her hands moved across parchment or soil, she began to notice patterns, how prayer shaped thought, how repetition bred clarity. Copying sacred texts, she saw meanings the priests overlooked. Translating psalms, she felt nuances of compassion missing from sermons. The very labor meant to confine her became a mirror reflecting her own intelligence. Some sisters began to write, first commentary, then visions, then entire treatises. The Church called them mystics, but in truth they were philosophers disguised as saints. Their language was born from experience, not doctrine. They spoke of God not as a distant judge, but as an intimate presence, a living warmth that could dwell within the human heart. This was radical. It implied that divine truth could be found without intermediaries, without priests, without men. Through their private revelations, they claimed a spiritual authority that no bishop could bestow. Hildegard of Bingen, for example, a 12th century abbess, wrote music, medicine, theology, and poetry. She called her writings the living light. Her letters reached popes and emperors, yet she never left the convent walls. Others followed: Julian of Norwich, Mechthild of Magdeburg, Catherine of Siena. Each of them lived in enclosure, yet their ideas rippled through Europe, reshaping how people imagined the soul. These women proved that isolation could be turned into illumination, that the silence forced upon them could become a trumpet of revelation. But the hidden power was not only in words, it was in care. Medieval Europe was a harsh world. Plague, famine, and war ravaged the population. While kings fought for glory and priests debated theology, nuns quietly tended the wounded. Their infirmaries became islands of mercy. They invented herbal remedies, catalogued plants, observed symptoms, kept records long before medicine became a science. In their compassion, they practiced an authority no one could forbid, the authority to heal. Even the simple act of teaching became an act of revolution. Some convents ran schools for girls, daughters of nobles and merchants who would never otherwise learn to read. Behind those walls, literacy blossomed. A sister teaching another woman to read scripture was planting a seed that centuries later would grow into education itself. Without these quiet teachers, much of Europe's learning might have vanished. To survive in a world that denied them power, they learned subtlety. The abbess, elected by her sisters, governed not with force but with moral authority. She negotiated with lords, managed estates, and balanced accounts. Some convents were wealthy, owning land and mills, producing wine and textiles. The abbess became, in effect, a female lord, signing documents, hiring workers, commanding respect through competence. In a time when most women were property, she was administrator, diplomat, and leader. Yet her strength was rarely acknowledged. When historians later wrote of medieval power, they mentioned kings and knights, never nuns. But the truth remains. Within those cloisters, women practiced governance centuries before the world allowed them thrones. Their power also manifested in creativity. Deprived of worldly pleasures, the nuns turned inward and upward, pouring emotion into art. They painted illuminated manuscripts where gold leaf shimmered like divine fire. They composed hymns that still echo through cathedrals today, music written not for applause but for communion. In crafting beauty, they asserted a quiet defiance. Even behind walls, they could create worlds. There was also the power of endurance. The convent demanded absolute obedience, yet not all commands were wise or just. Many sisters learned to obey outwardly while preserving inner judgment. They mastered the art of holy disobedience, appearing compliant while subtly resisting cruelty. When a rule endangered the weak, they found loopholes. When punishment went too far, they interceded. Their compassion was their rebellion. They learned how to bend without breaking, how to survive without surrendering the last corner of their conscience. Some abbesses became protectors, sheltering women accused of heresy or illegitimacy. The Church's courts feared such mercy, for it diluted their control. But mercy, once practiced, multiplies. These women understood something their superiors did not, that moral authority flows from kindness, not coercion, and beneath every act of endurance lay an unspoken truth. These women had learned to wield power from the inside out. They could not change the hierarchy, but they could change how holiness itself was understood. Their spirituality centered not on punishment, but on connection, the belief that God dwells within every living soul. That idea would echo through centuries, influencing reformers and philosophers alike, but such strength came at a cost. The Church distrusted women who thought too freely. Many of these mystics and leaders faced suspicion, even persecution. Their visions were tested for heresy, their writings censored or destroyed. Yet the more the Church tried to silence them, the more their words survived, copied in secret, shared by other sisters who recognized truth when they heard it. The convent became not only a prison, but a network of quiet revolutionaries bound by